everyone, I hope you're all well. I am here today to speak to you about histories of emergency management. This lecture's a bit straightforward. It's fairly well content based, and I'm hoping that I've got all of the facts correct. I found it pretty difficult to pull this lecture together because there is no sort of history written about emergency management except for those within a specific context. So I could read about the history of emergency management, for instance, in the US, which usually focuses on the governance processes and so forth, and how this organisation was disbanded and then this one was taken up and all of those types of things. There's very little information about the history of emergency management, particularly in Australia. So it's been quite difficult for me to cobble this together. So fingers crossed it's useful and that you get something out of it. All right, so the histories of emergency management are definitely long, and this doesn't mean that they are, drawn out processes or anything like that. It means that we have evidence that these practices have been happening for a long time. And you might remember that last week I put a picture of Noah's Ark on one of the slides because it is one of the most common stories that's raised in emergency management discussions, looking at, when Moses parted the Red Sea, perhaps that was the first example of flood management. When Noah did this, of course, is another example of flood management. But these are, religious narratives rather than things that we necessarily have evidence of that happened and all of that sort of stuff. What we do have evidence of is, interestingly enough, some cave paintings that show cave dwellers dealing with major disasters in their time. So it's very clear that these processes are something that human beings have had to get their head around for a while. But the ways in which these things happened really varies depending on where you are, what has happened, all of those types of things. And the level of skills that a lot of different places will have will often be dependent on the extent to which they have to deal with different types of disasters on a regular basis, and particularly throughout history. So the way that it's sort of talked about, and this is quite an unfortunate surname of Bumgarner, but he talks about two different ways of thinking about a history of emergency management. One is as a history of a discipline, and the other is as a history of emergency management and disaster response activity. And if we look at the history of activities, it's very long. One example, which has been documented a little bit in the historical books, is a pharaoh, Amenemhet, I think it is. I apologise if I've got that wrong. Chances are I have got it wrong. This particular pharaoh developed the first river control program. So they developed a water diversion system along the Nile River so that it would redirect the flood waters, and they would be able to claim, I think it was like 150,000 acres of agricultural land. So that was one of the first ever examples of emergency management, because the river was flooding with obvious regularity. So they had to come up with a system that really helped them overcome that so that they could continue to work the land for different agricultural purposes. So in terms of response activities, we have quite a lot of history to move towards. The history of the discipline is fairly new. And what we're talking about here is the ideas and processes involved in emergency management, and even the thought around the idea of emergency management being something that could be taught and that people could do as a job, and all of these different things. They're very, very new. So it was originally a sub-discipline of public administration and particularly public safety. So the broader public administration would be focused on, all of these different elements that they did, such as criminal justice administration, and emergency management would be part of that. And of course, public safety more generally. However, more recently, emergency management has come to take on an identity of its own, with its own administration, obviously, so it's still linked to that public administration broadly, but with its own professional skill set. And in very recent times, particularly the last 20 years, they've thought about the idea that emergency managers are a particular role or form of employment, a position within an organisation, and that they need a certain skill set in order to do that particular role. So that's what's new, I suppose, about the histories of emergency management. So how we think about emergency management then is pretty much a 20th century development. Managing disasters using global standards and policies, structures and organised efforts to help address a preparedness, mitigation and response activity for a wide range of disasters. It didn't start in until around the mid-20th century. And you can see a picture there of these different people coming together and talking through a certain incident and all of those types of things. If you've been involved in SES or police or ambulance, anywhere like this, you'll sort of recognise this form of operational or command and control focused approach where there's people from different areas looking after different areas and coming together to try and resolve a particular emergency. So early histories were very much shaped by disaster events. And this really depended, how developed emergency management was, depended on where you lived, really, because it would depend on whether or not you'd experienced an emergency or whether that was something that just didn't happen in your local community. It's really quite fascinating. I would have thought that wasn't the case, but it is. So much emergency management governance that we have in Australia and internationally was motivated by historical disasters and emergencies. A great example of this is the US, because they have quite old historical documentation around this stuff now. So for instance, the US Constitution did not make provision for the government to provide financial or organisational assistance to state or local governments in the event of a disaster, which is really quite extraordinary. In fact, it was the responsibility of the local people. So a great example would be in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, because the incident that they had, which was a fairly substantial fire, and in fact, Portsmouth had very regular fires. They commonly call them the Christmas fires, which pretty much every Christmas they would have some sort of fire that would decimate most of their local community. But this one was substantial. In 1802, it destroyed 132 buildings, lots and lots of lives lost. Everybody was homeless. It was a real disaster. This was the first time that they thought, well, actually, we kind of do need to help these people. But at that particular point, the government didn't have the power to help the people and give them financial assistance to rebuild. So what they did was, because it wasn't in the Constitution, sorry, I should have made that really clear. So there was nothing in the Constitution that said that local or state governments needed to actually help people and help them repair the damage of the fire or the disaster or whatever. So it was just about people rendering assistance if they chose to. It wasn't even something that people necessarily had to do. So they passed the Fire Disaster Relief Act, which made it possible and kind of mandated local governments to render assistance to these people in those circumstances. So we can see that there was a bit of a shift in the social philosophy broadly around emergency management. The governments of particularly local and state governments had a much more of a role to play now in these processes. And it was very much about establishing that legal base which enabled that to happen. So the legal foundation allowed this shift away from it's something that the community has to deal with to it's something that governments have to deal with. It came through those legal frameworks. And this was also spurred on quite a bit by wartime and warfare technologies and so forth. So governments of industrialised nations began to form elaborate systems of civil defence, sort of tried to combat the threat posed by air raids and particularly nuclear attack. And this wasn't something that was thought of even before this particular time, because obviously we didn't have planes. All of those types of things needed to come into effect until we genuinely thought, wow, other countries can just come over and drop bombs on our people. We need to do something about this. So they had different detection systems, early warning alarms, bomb shelters and other hardened shelter facilities, standardised and specialised training for different types of groups, hazard-specific equipment, supplies and protocols, centralised targeted funding, which was really important. Until then, governments really didn't put money aside for these types of things, so they literally had nothing that they could provide. Search and rescue teams, of course, as well as local and regional coordination in some forms. And of course, we know we still have those types of coordinators now. They have the regional coordinators, for instance, attached to police as well as SES and a whole bunch of other different areas too. So this was very new, this shift in how we were thinking about emergency management. And we were entering what was called the civil defence era. And this is probably the most prominent historical era of emergency management. It was very much brought about by the Cold War and World War II. Everyone's minds, in the governments at least, turned to emergency preparedness and management amongst the people, as well as amongst government organisations and non-government organisations. Civil defence was the major focus, and they did build a lot of bomb shelters and things like that. Australia generally followed what happened in the UK, obviously. They had an air raid precautions organisation in the UK, and that ran in most states through the civil defence organisation. However, in some states it was just run on its own. It wasn't actually controlled by another organisation. I think New South Wales might have been one of the exceptions in that particular instance. So they policed and regulated things like blackouts, fire guard messengers, emergency first response, obviously until they were relieved by emergency and rescue services. And of course they were trained in basic firefighting and first aid and all of those types of things. They also helped bombed out householders and assisted the police with crowd control in situations of an emergency. So they had a really, really important role. Legislations were also passed to enable the federal government to share financial responsibility of repairing the damage. So this happened, I think, a little bit earlier in the US, but over here in Australia, this was fairly recent. It was particularly looking at the financial responsibility of public facilities, not necessarily for householders. That came when they implemented legislation that enabled insurance schemes so that people could get, paid out for different types of disasters in different types of insurance schemes. As we know, that's still quite problematic depending on what area you're in. I remember when I experienced the Brisbane floods, I wasn't personally affected by it because I was living on the outskirts of Brisbane. But when the Brisbane floods went through, there were a lot of people, even 12 months down the track, still awaiting knowledge or information about whether or not they could claim on their insurance because of the wording around some insurance schemes. So some people would ring up and their insurer and say, oh, my house has been flooded. Can you please, I need to make a claim, blah, 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 blah. And they'd say, I'm sorry, we don't cover floods because physically the word flood wasn't in their insurance. So there's still a lot of areas where this sort of stuff has a few bugs to iron out overall, and I only know that because a lot of the people that were telling me about those processes during the floods. So these different forms of legislative frameworks also required governments to become involved in disaster response and preparedness. And of course, the word preparedness immediately indicates serious levels of education in order to tell the community how to be prepared in the event of a disaster. So federal governments now had to work hard with the state and local governments governments in a coordinated relief effort, and that sort of stuff didn't happen before. In Australia, public protection was very much on the radar again with the Cold War and the nuclear threat. But in the mid-1950s, the ARP was disbanded and the new Civil Defence Organisation was created. After the war, there was largely a focus on responding to natural and human-made disasters rather than military attack. So again, we're seeing another very different shift in the way that emergency management is being thought about. So we've gone from focusing on raids and bomb threats and nuclear threat and things like that to a much broader sense of natural hazards, which is the most common experience in Australia. So the 60s and 70s involved honing the emergency management response, and this happened in a whole range of different ways, but it was the civil defence organisations that were called upon in this context most regularly in Australia. And it saw the realigning of civil defence organisations away from wartime protection and towards protection from disasters and natural hazards more broadly. Having said that, governments definitely improved. Legislations were passed around the insurance issues that I talked about before, as well as for providing financial support directly from state and local governments. But that didn't necessarily mean that things were harmonised. There's a lot of discussion in the US particularly about how difficult it was to navigate emergency management in the time of a crisis. So, for instance, people talk about a quagmire of related agencies who didn't actually talk to one another. So they created FEMA, which was the Federal Emergency Management Agency, in 1979 in order to make this more easy to navigate, and so that everyone had an organised hub under which emergency management fell. So this led to the establishment of, particularly through consolidating 3 major agencies doing this type of emergency management work at the time. We've got the Federal Preparedness Agency, the Defence Civil Preparedness Agency, and the Federal Disaster Assistance Administration. So all of these programs and organisations came together and created FEMA to make it less difficult to navigate in the event of an emergency, and also to bring people together under one roof, which is often helpful. So more recently, probably 1980s to now, we've definitely moved towards this consolidated understanding or a discipline of emergency management, and even more recently than that, the disaster resilience stuff, which is what I touched on last week. There's a movement away from this notion of civil defence, and those organisations moved away from wartime, and this was reflected particularly in Australia by a change of name. In 1974, we had the Natural Disaster Organisation established by the federal government in the Department of Defence. It had a limited role of support, providing only coordination and training, and it lacked control over the state organisations, the civil defence organisations particularly, that were involved in crisis response. And of course, it lacked resources in those types of circumstances and didn't actually manage responses on the ground. So all of this was consolidated in the 1980s and things came together. So the NDO was relaunched as Emergency Management Australia in 1993 and was shifted out of the Department of Defence to the Attorney General's Department. Now this is quite significant because there has been huge amounts of criticism of the American approach where FEMA is now in the Department of Homeland Security and works within that. And of course, when Hurricane Katrina came about, which was an absolute, it was just massive, it changed the way that we think about emergency management profoundly, which is why I focus on that in one whole week in this unit. There was a lot of criticism of FEMA because they were focused so much up until that point on anti-terrorism, counter-terrorism measures. And people were getting really peeved about the fact that the response was appalling. They didn't have enough money to deal with something like Hurricane Katrina, and that they weren't organised enough and have the structures and plans in place to make things happen quickly enough because they were so focused on counter-terrorism. So in Australia, that was a bit different because we've never had a significant historical counterterrorism event. We've always been focused on the things that impact us most. And of course, those things are natural disasters, fires and floods, and cyclones up north in particular. So that's sort of been a major focus for quite some time now. International frameworks that helped work across all of the jurisdictions globally came much later, interestingly enough. So the United Nations weren't really thinking about this stuff before about 1991, even though we had the Declaration of Human Rights and all of those types of things. In general, they weren't thinking about this as a key issue until this resolution came through from the General Assembly. The resolution strengthened the UN's response to complex emergencies and natural disasters, and earlier UN organisations, the Department of Humanitarian Affairs, the Office of United Nations Disaster Relief Coordinator, they came together to create OCHA, as it's called, ironically enough, in the current Australian context. As well as that, the DHA merged into OCHA in 1988. Sorry, I forgot to make that focus before. And OCHA became the UN focal point for disasters and dealing with the outcomes of disasters. I wouldn't argue that it's totally fabulous now. We've still got quite a lot of issues to work through. For instance, one of the examples that I just used for another unit is looking at sexual exploitation and abuse of CIVPOL, UN CIVPOL, which is a policing organisation attached to the United Nations. They often take police personnel out of developing nations particularly, and they put them into areas where there are large-scale natural disasters or refugee crises. In those circumstances, the local legislation doesn't apply to those individuals, and we have no international legislation which applies to those individuals. So there are quite literally no mechanisms available for us at this particular point to take those police that have been organising sexual exploitation of people in local communities and putting them through the courts. So it's a very significant governance issue at the moment. But it just shows you that we've got, even though there's international frameworks that have been in place for a little while, we've still got a little bit to go. Internationally, so moving away from the Australian context for a moment, there's been a shift towards security in some parts of the world, and I would argue that this has been motivated very much by terrorism threats and large-scale terrorism incidents. So FEMA was incorporated into the Department of Homeland Security after September 11 in particular, but this didn't mean effectiveness of FEMA, and a lot of criticism came out of the Hurricane Katrina in particular, and led to the advent of the Post-Katrina Emergency Reform Act in 2006, which I'll touch on when we speak about that particular disaster. But there were huge criticisms, and there's an entire document of about 727 pages, if I remember correctly, that documents the failings in Hurricane Katrina in particular. So the histories of this area are exceedingly complex, not well documented. We don't have a huge amount of evidence or documentary histories of the types of responses that have been put into place in the past. So it really is quite ad hoc, and it really is dependent on who was there, how the government was thinking about it at the time, as to whether or not those issues were taken seriously. And they often had to put stuff into place simply as a matter of responding to something that had happened in the immediate time frame. So even more recently, we can see that there has been a major focus or move towards this notion of disaster resilience that we'll probably pick up on in the next couple of weeks again, and very much a lot of criticisms looking towards the future of that traditional command and control decision-making processes. So the focus is on looking at these centres where all of these people come together and they're making decisions literally sometimes in seconds, about what will happen, where resources will go, how it will unfold, all of those types of things. And because of that, it's almost always focused on the response, as opposed to looking broadly at things like recovery, mitigation, preparedness, and so forth. For instance, police don't often think about themselves as being a core part of recovery, when in fact they probably often are part of that recovery. Things such as domestic violence come out of emergencies where police are involved in going and responding to those circumstances, and they often don't think about how that might be linked to a particular emergency or disaster which has happened in the local area. So these sorts of defence-orientated, silo-driven approaches and very much centralised approaches proved incapable of dealing with modern risks and crises that they incubated. Consequently, these frameworks had to give way to newer models of crisis management, which in turn reflected contemporary views about governance. So we're seeing much more decentralised subsidiarity, I can't even say that word, and a greater respect for the self-organising non-state actor, which of course is you and me, the people in the local communities. And this is what became fashionable within crisis management policy. So a very, very big shift in those later years that we've been seeing. Anyway, now that I've made your heads hurt and I've given you a whole bunch of content, I hope that was useful, and that's where I'll leave you. Have a wonderful week, and I shall see you next week. See you later.